Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. In this video today we are going to start talking about the text that is involved with your Java programs. So we have already covered up to this point, variables, we have covered input and output. So now that we have covered those along with our data types, we can continue on and start working more with text within our programs. So the most common data that you'll work with inside of any of your Java programs is going to be what is called a string. So you've been using strings this whole time. If you've been following the series, there's been multiple times where we used text and used it within print statements. Anytime you're using any input from a user, anytime you want to display text in your program. These are all moments where we have been working with strings, but we just did not have a name attached to it yet. So now we're going to pretty much take a deeper look into the strings, understand how they work, what they're for, and how you will continue to use them throughout your learning journey. So what you need to know is that a string is a sequence of characters. So think of a sequence of characters as letters that make up a word, or they can even make up sentences. So a string is going to be notated by having double quotes. So you would place double quotes around whatever the text is. As long as the text is inside of a double quote, that is what you would consider a string. So it is used to store, words, sentences, messages, pretty much any sort of text that you will be using inside of your code. So here on the screen, we have some examples of strings. As you see, we have double quotes around all of these strings, and pretty much they can be one word, they can be two words, they can be 10 words or more. There is really no limit to the amount of words you can have in a string, but these are all going to be string examples. We know they're string examples simply because they have the double quotes around them. So anytime in a program that you see words with double quotes around them, then that is what we refer to as a string. So think of a string as a data type, and it pretty much is used just to store your text data. So when you are working with this data type, similar to how we have int, boolean, double, instead of those, we would be using string. And you need to make sure when you use this string data type that you're not typing the string with the lowercase like how the other data types are, but you're capitalizing the S. And the reason you're capitalizing the S is because this string data type is actually from a built-in class within the Java programming language, and we're pretty much calling it and using it in our code as needed. So yes, a string can be considered a data type, but they don't necessarily behave the same way as the primitive data types that we have already covered. So let's look how the strings are different. So one thing you need to note is that strings are not primitive. So when we covered the 8 primitive data types, you did not see string on that list. The reason that string is not on that list is because string is an object that belongs to a built-in class. So therefore, yes, it is a data type, but it is not a data type on its own. It was created within a class. So because it was created in a class is why strings are a little different from primitive data types, because they have methods or actions that you can call onto them. So when you're using methods, the method will allow you to complete some sort of action on that object. And in this case, we're referring to the object as a string. So now that you know a little bit about a string, we are going to look at how to actually store text or strings in a variable. So to create or declare your string, you first need to start off with the word string. So it needs to be capitalized, the S, and then you give it the variable name. So if you take a look at the examples I provided, you see we have string name, string message, string input. Now in all three of these cases, we're not initializing it, we're not giving it any values, we're just pretty much creating the variable. Now, when you want to declare and initialize it, you would simply do the same thing as the previous slide, except now we would be throwing in the assignment operator and giving it a value. So again, in the examples you see, we have string name equals AJ. AJ is our string. You see we have string message. This is Java. This is Java is our string. And the last one is a little bit different. We have string input. And pretty much this input is taking in the text from the scanner. So remember, anytime you are using a scanner, it automatically is going to represent a string of text. So when you are assigning it to a string, that's because any input from your scanner is automatically a string, so it will not cause any problems. So this is what we have worked on in the previous videos. So now that we know how to create our string, we are going to get into string variables versus string literals. So your string literals, that is going to be what you actually consider the text in the quotes. So that would be literally just the words, hello, this is Java, for example. However, the string variable is going to be the name that stores a string value. So city, store, for example, in on this screen. So think of the literal as the actual text or the actual string, and your variable is the name that is holding that string. So you may hear as you continue to code that you hear string literals, you may hear string variables, and literals are just the text. But your variables can change and are used in expressions. So literals don't necessarily change, but literals can be stored in variables. And your variables also, like I mentioned, can change. So now that we've covered the difference between those two common terminologies you may hear when working with strings, another thing you need to know with strings is that every character in a string is going to have a position. So when we're referring to a position of something in Java, we call that an index. And an index is going to represent the position of a character in the string that we're working with. Now, unlike your normal counting in math, where you typically start from 1, indexes in Java start at 0. So your counting will start from 0 and work its way up. So anytime you're working with indexes, if you need to access, let's say, the last character, it will always be the length of that object minus 1 because, again, you're starting from 0. Now, if you take a look at our screenshot here, we have the word hello. And if you see, our first letter starts at 0 and works its way up. So that is pretty much how you would be working with indexes in your string and finding a position of a character, which you can then use in a method. So now let's continue to look at other ways we can use strings in Java. First is going to be string concatenation. In a sense, you were introduced to this recently by using the plus sign. So this is used to combine two or more strings into one, and you can do this by using the plus operator. And this will make a little bit more sense when we revisit our code for a coding tutorial. Here's an example of a screenshot of code. So if you see our first variable, we have first, our second variable, we have last, and they're basically holding the first and the last name of an individual. Then we create a variable called full name, and you see we are then adding the variable first plus, and then you see there's quotes in between that. Those quotes are going to represent a space. So if you take a look at string first and string last, you notice that there is no space at the end of Alex. And there's also no space before Johnson. So if you were to add in full name, if you were just to say first plus last, what will happen is Alex Johnson would be one word. However, in this take where we are adding that empty double quotes in between them, it's pretty much simulating the space being added there. Now, technically, what you could do is at the end of Alex, you could add a space, or at the beginning of Johnson, you could add a space, and then you can remove that empty quote altogether in full name. But if you don't do that, then this would be the proper way to then add a space between your actual variables. So in this case, this is how you would combine two strings using the plus sign. So you can also concatenate using text and variables. So in the previous one, we were basically only using variables, but that's not always the case in real coding. You can use variables and strings and put them together immediately. And if for some case you decide that you want to work with numbers, Java will automatically convert the numbers to text for you inside of the print statement. So if you look at this example, we have int age equals 20. And in our print statement, you're pretty much saying age, and then we want to add that variable to the text. And pretty much what it would do is say age colon 20. So that is how you can also work with variables and text. So now that we've looked at some common ways of working with strings, another thing you need to be aware of is something called escape sequences. So escape sequences are symbols or that you would use to pretty much do some sort of what you would call a keyboard operation on your text. So it'll make sense in a little bit, but they basically will begin with a backslash, as you see in the parentheses. So to give you an idea of what I mean by keyboard actions, or in the example on the screen, we have our first escape sequence, which is \n. \n is like the equivalent of saying new line, or on your keyboard, the equivalent of you pressing enter. So you basically want to go to the new line to start something or print something else. \t represents if you were to press a tab on your keyboard. \double quote is if you actually want to use double quotes in your text. So remember, in Java, a double quote means that it is a string. So if you just put a double quote into a string, it's going to ignore it because it's basically thinking that you're referring to it as a string. So to prevent that from happening, you have to use an escape sequence, which is \double quote. And then that will allow you to then see the double quote actually appear within your string. And lastly, you have \\, which is if you want to use a backslash, because if you notice here, for us to use our escape sequence, we have to use a backslash. So if you just put one backslash, it's going to think that you're trying to use the escape sequence. So you have to let the escape sequence know, hey, I'm using a backslash in the sentence, \\. So these are some common ways that can help you format your text in a specific way if you're trying to print it out in a certain manner to be more useful in your program. So now working with examples of escape sequences. In our first example, you see we have a backslash in between hello world. So by doing this, it's pretty much telling your print statement, after hello, I want to start a new line, or the equivalent of hitting enter, and then print out the word world, or whatever words come after it. So our output would be hello on one line and world on the next. In the second example, we have the backslash double quote, which is going to allow us to use a double quote in our print statement, because remember, a string is represented by a double quote. So if you just use a double quote by itself to represent a double quote, your program is going to think it's a string and it's not going to work out how you believe it is. So for you to actually visibly see a double quote in your output, you have to use backslash double quote as we have here on both sides. So the backslash has to go before each quote that you want to display in your string. So in our output, you see our double quote is around the word hi, and our escape sequence is around the word hi. So that is how you would use escape sequences when you need to format your Java strings. So basically, escape sequences are going to allow you to control how you are formatting your text or your strings, and how you use special characters that may be used for other things in Java. So now that we have covered all of those things, we also have strings in user input, as I mentioned in the last videos as well as earlier on this video. Anything you enter into the scanner is automatically by default a string or text. So when you are working with storing the user input, you need to use the string data type. So string word equals input.next in the first example. You would use .next if you only want one singular word. So if a user is using a scanner and they are entering in information, as soon as the user hits the space bar, that is the only word that is captured, or let me rephrase it, that is the only input that is captured. So as soon as a user hits space, whatever they type prior to the space is what is then stored into the variable. If there is a case that you want to get the whole line of input, including spaces, you would use .next line. So in the previous lecture I covered, I pretty much recommended that you always use .next line, and that's just make sure that pretty much anything the user enters into the scanner at that moment that is text will all be included and stored in the variable it is assigned to. So technically you can use either or when working with user input, but I always prefer the second. So now we have pretty much covered all of the basics to strings. We covered what strings are. We covered how you can create them and add values to their variables or give values to them. We talked about string concatenation, which allows you to combine your strings together. We've even covered escape sequences that will allow you to format your strings in different ways according to how you normally would if you were to use a Word document, for example. And we also talked about how strings work with input or your scanner. So overall, these are the basic things and ways that you can use strings in Java. And in the next lecture video we complete, we will begin discussing what is called string methods, which will allow you to work with the strings a little bit further. So thank you for your time in watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.